Hello and welcome to Module 8. The main part of this module will be to review for the final exam. So this video can serve, if you want, as a study guide, or I sort of think of it as a replacement for the review class that we would typically have in a face-to-face class on the last class day. So the first thing that I want to talk to you about is that we do not have a discussion 8. As we move forward, you're going to have a quiz that's going to cover the material that is on the study guide. So you should wait. You shouldn't take it until you've looked at the study guide. I always wonder about people who think it's so important to get work done that they don't do the preliminary first, which would be read the study guide. And then the last big assignment that you're going to have is the final exam. So it's a quarter of your grade. So right now, whatever grade you have could change dramatically. So I would certainly spend as much of the next couple weeks studying as I could. An awful lot of people say, well, I'll study the night before. And then, but think about this. Think about this. How did you do on the midterm? And remember, this is longer than the midterm, and it's going to be comprehensive. There's going to be questions from each of the chapters that we've covered, chapters 1 through 12 in the course. Now, there's going to be a few more questions for the last several chapters. I believe the last 5 chapters each have 6 questions, except one has 5. So that's 29 questions from the second half of the course, and only 21 questions from the first half of the course. Each of the first 7 chapters is going to have 3. And actually, if you remember, we covered chapters 1 through 6 and chapter 9 in the first half of the course. So each of those will have 3 questions, and essentially each of the others will have 6. So there's a total of 50 questions, and they're all multiple choice, 4 possible answers, and you pick the best one. Don't give away the points on the quiz. In a way, you have 8 days to clear that out before you have to take the final exam. I really don't see why people wait till the last minute, and then things come up, and they always do. They always do. I had a friend who had 3 exams during the final day of exam week. I don't know, I guess it would have been his junior year in college. And he waited till the last minute, even though 2 of these were take-home exams that he could have completed right away. And then he comes to find out that everyone has to be out of his dorm by, I don't remember the time exactly, let's say 5 o'clock on the last day. He ended up having to be done by 5 o'clock, and it played havoc with him. I'm sure he was a great student. I'm sure he figured it out somehow. Well, anyway, the thing to keep in mind is that something will come up. Some disaster will befall you. So if you look at the study guide, it says 50 multiple choice questions. It says that you have 70 minutes. Those are probably 2 pretty good questions I could ask on the quiz. So, keep that in mind. You're allowed open notes. You're allowed to use your book. You're allowed to have anything that you've written down, you're allowed to use. The one thing that you can't do is work with somebody else. I actually figured out a way that I can double check against whether you've worked with somebody else, and it would be unfortunate to get caught. This is the kind of class where to mess up and have to take it again because you were caught cheating on an exam you're probably going to pass anyway. So the exam will be comprehensive. 3 questions from each of chapters 1 through 6 and chapter 9. Chapters 7 and 8 and 10 through 12 will have 5 or 6 questions. 70 minutes for 50 questions. You certainly want to not have to look up all of the answers one by one. So make sure that you have organized your notes, before you take the exam, and that'll help you very, very much. So let's turn to some of the questions. So we have 3 questions with Chapter 1, and looking through these briefly, I note that there will probably be questions related to the collective action problems that we talked about at the beginning of the course. Chapter 1 deals a little bit with the American system, but it kind of defines some terms for different governmental organizations and structures. It kind of looks at politics from a more global perspective, what's a republic, what's a monarchy, things like that. But it also has questions related to things like the prisoner's dilemma and the tragedy of the commons and coordination problems, sort of talking about why governments exist at all. I do have a question in here that kind of applies the concept of a collective action problem, where you have a person and it describes what they are, what they're doing in the scenario. But it shouldn't be very hard if you know the key terms, like I said, related to prisoner's dilemma, tragedy of the commons. Remember, I talk about the chicken game in the slides, coordination problems, and things attendant to that. Chapter 2 talks a lot about the U.S. Constitution and the Constitutional Convention and what people often term American political development. So when you're looking at these questions, you might want to be familiar with the various plans by the state governments for how the legislature should be set up, the Virginia plan, the New Jersey plan, the Connecticut Compromise, which is often called the Great Compromise. You should know some of the terms for the structure of government. We talked about this a little bit in Chapter 2, where I talk about Article 1 establishing the Congress, and Article 2 establishing the presidency, and Article 3 establishes the judicial branch, or the courts. So you should definitely look into this a little bit. It would be reasonable to talk about the term bicameralism, the term federalism, even things like checks and balances and how a bill becomes a law. We'll talk more about the powers of the presidency when we get to Chapter 7, so you might not have a lot here in Chapter 2 about that. It would be fair game for me to ask you about how the Constitution was ratified, the need to have a Bill of Rights. And the Bill of Rights is not in the original Constitution. It's actually added by the first Congress. It's the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. So Chapter 3 talks about federalism. And federalism is an important idea related to the U.S. Constitution and the U.S. political system. If you have any questions about that, we have this comparison between cooperative and dual federalism that might be interesting to talk about. We might talk about centralization. And there's some constitutional amendments, some that have strengthened the power of the U.S. government, while others have strengthened the power of the state governments. And so I think that you should be familiar with those. There's some provisions of the actual Constitution, like the Necessary and Proper Clause, but also think about things like the 10th Amendment and the 14th Amendment and what they do related to the relationship in the U.S. federal system between the state government and the national government. So Chapter 4 talks about civil rights. I know that I asked a bunch of questions in the past about about the various ways that African Americans were kept from voting. So those would be fair game. Remember, the grandfather clause doesn't actually stop anybody from voting, but it caused, it required or allowed whites to register to vote in the South without having to pass the literacy test. Interestingly enough, one of the ways that they justified this is that this was a way that Massachusetts had kept immigrants from voting at the turn of the 20th century. And the southern states who didn't invent it said, hey, we know how to do this even more effectively. And so the literacy test is something that's no longer required or allowed, but the grandfather clause was designed to get around it for the people who you wanted to be able to vote. Not actually used very often, if you think about it. It's kind of would be embarrassing to say, yeah, my grandfather used to vote, but I can't even read. So that's something that is it's important more because of the blatant unfairness of it. But you should be aware of that. In addition to discrimination in voting rights, there will be some questions about segregation by law, and segregation just as a way of practice. There'll be a question about women and the right to vote. So there you go. There's a tip-off. You already get something out of taking this review. So let's get into this with a little bit more detail now. All right, so Chapter 5 talks about civil liberties. Remember, we actually have a list of civil liberties that are in the U.S. Constitution, and I would encourage you all to, along with the Chapter 4 and Chapter 5 slides, there's a list of civil liberties in the U.S. Constitution. They would all be fair game here. The First Amendment is one of my favorite amendments, so I ask questions related to the First Amendment a lot. One of the questions that I like to ask is, which of the following provisions is a civil liberty that's in the First Amendment? Obviously, you can get that wrong either by picking something that isn't a civil liberty, or something that is a civil liberty but isn't in the First Amendment. So some awareness of all of the civil liberties could be very useful. There were some important court cases. I think that understanding and knowing what the Miranda rule was is really important. I believe that's a key term, but if it's not, still be sure to know what the Miranda rule is. The book talks about it. I believe that we did not. So if you're unfamiliar with the Miranda rule and what it did and how it developed, I would take a moment, just look it up. And then the other would be the Lemon test. There was this case, Lemon v. Kurtzman, and it was related to the free exercise of religion. So you'll probably want to be familiar with it if you are not. Somebody asked me, how many court cases should I be familiar with? Well, at least those. I would say Brown versus Board of Education is also an important one to be familiar with. Marbury versus Madison, right, is the one that establishes the right to judicial review that we'll probably talk about a little bit in Chapter 9. If you're familiar with wrong answers, that helps you too. So Chapter 6, we change gears a little bit and we start to talk about an American political institution, which is the Congress. And we talked about that a lot in the first half of the course, so we don't need to talk about it much more. But we do have 3 questions. One that a lot of students get wrong is about gerrymandering. Try to understand what gerrymandering is as it's related to Congress. Try to think of ways that gerrymandering is less important in the Senate than it is in the House. Um, there's an obvious answer to that. Well, in retrospect, it will seem obvious. Maybe you could think about it first. When it comes to Congress, you should know both the names of the leaders and you should know the actual leadership position, so that if I were to ask you who the Speaker of the House is, you should know it's Nancy Pelosi. But if I say who's the most powerful member of the House of Representatives, you should know that it's the Speaker of the House, who is Nancy Pelosi. If I were to ask you who the most powerful person is in the U.S. Senate, Majority Leader. The President of the Senate, as we recall, is the Vice President of the United States. And so the Vice President is the President of the Senate. That confuses a few people. I've actually had students identify the person who's the most powerful person in the Senate as the Speaker of the Senate. There is no Speaker of the Senate. And then a question that we didn't talk about much. We didn't talk about the pocket veto. So I would encourage you to look that up. All right, so as we move on to chapter 7, chapter 7 is going to have 6 questions. Chapter 7 deals with the presidency. We'll talk about the president's powers. Remember, the president's power, according to the book, is divided into his powers as head of state and his power of head as government. We actually in the book talked about the 6 powers of the president: his military power, his diplomatic power, his political power, and his executive, legislative, and judicial powers. You should be familiar with all of those. His power as a military power and his diplomatic power are probably most associated with his power as head of state, whereas his political power is just his power as the leading political figure in the country. His power of executive, legislative, and judicial power are more associated with his power as head of government, the tip-off would be that those are all branches of the U.S. government: executive, legislative, and judicial. So where do those powers come from? You might want to be familiar with divided government. You might want to be familiar with some aspects of the president's power, say like executive agreements, executive privilege, executive orders. And you might want to be familiar a little bit with the people, with the White House staff, the Brownlow Committee, ideas like that. Now, Chapter 8 talks about the bureaucracy. So with the bureaucracy, you're going to want to know Weber's characteristics of a bureaucracy. You're going to want to know some of the ways that the bureaucracy is managed, both internally with things like inspectors general and externally. You might want to look at the ways that Congress investigates the president, rules that the bureaucracy needs to follow, ideas like bureaucratic culture, how they make rules. Chapter 9 is another one of the chapters that only has 3 questions. It's about the judiciary. And so I think that you might want to, so we might want to know who the people are who are on the Supreme Court currently, who's the newest justice. That is a question that changed right recently. Who amongst a group of justices is not on is no longer on the Supreme Court would be a fair question. Things like that. How many justices are on the court? How does the court decide to take cases? How many justices have to decide to take a new case before they take a new case? Questions like that. Chapter 10 talks about public opinion. A few of you struggled with this. Make sure that you're familiar with concepts related to scientific polling. Polling took a hit in the last election. It seems like it's wrong as often as it's right anymore. And the reason why is because it's almost impossible to determine who's actually voting. You know, the math behind it is that if everybody tells you the truth and you know what the population is, that you ought to be able to draw a sample randomly and know something about the general population from it. The problem is people don't tell pollsters the truth, especially about whether they're going to vote or not. So we don't really know who's going to vote. But understanding scientific polling is particularly important, especially in this class, but overall. Talk about aggregate public opinion, such as the presidential job approval. One thing that perhaps was predictable with this last election was that President Trump would have trouble because his job approval never quite got to the 47–48% number that gives the president an advantage in getting reelected. You'll want to be familiar with partisanship, ideology, core values, and attitudes are each important key terms that you should be familiar with. Chapter 11 deals with voting and elections. It seems like just about every election causes us to rethink some of the things that we think we know about elections. But you know, some of these are key terms like focus group and issue public that you should be familiar with. Some of the questions relate to primary versus general elections, mobilization, which we don't actually talk about, but another word for mobilization is getting out the vote or get out the vote or GOTV. We talk about campaigning some. The difference between presidential and midterm elections, how people decide how they're going to vote. Remember, the main way that people decide how they're going to vote is the party label. If you associate with one of the parties, then you tend to vote for its candidates. And then finally, the final chapter that we deal with is chapter 12, and it's about political parties. We're at the threshold, I think, of declaring a new party system, one where the Democrats win most of the time, at least at the presidential level. Things seem to be roughly even, right, at the congressional level and the state level, where the Republicans actually control a few more state legislatures than the Democrats do. The Republicans and the Democrats are almost evenly divided in both the House and the Senate right now. And our elections are pretty close. So this is very different, I'd say, from the previous system where the Republicans seem to have a slight advantage, or the one before that was very durable, which was the New Deal coalition. We should know what the New Deal coalition was, when it started, a couple of the times that we've proposed that maybe it ended, like the 60s or the 80s or even 1994. We should have some familiarity with party conventions. Remember, the Democrats invented the National Party Convention. Some people argue that the Democratic Party is the first mass political party in the world, which is to say linking the voter with the party in the government and causing the voters to work to elect and have a permanent attachment to the people who are in government. A couple more thoughts. How do we pick major party nominees? We pick them in primaries. The convention is largely ceremonial. In fact, if you remember the party convention, they were on television and they were kind of mock conventions in that the candidate would speak to a camera, and there might or might not even have been anybody there. If you remember 4 years ago, the conventions, these people would talk in front of thousands of party insiders, and then it would be filmed by television. And I have a question about, here, I'll just read you the question. I say, the country generally credited for having invented the secret ballot for national elections. It wasn't the United States. In fact, if there's anything that the month of November taught me, was that the American political system seems to be having a few problems right now. I think if you looked around the world, the one thing that might shock them the most is that it takes us a month to count ballots. If you've ever watched a British election, if you've ever watched an election in the United Kingdom, you can do that. Whenever they have an election, it's covered on BBC, and you turn on BBC or Sky News. In fact, you can watch the Sky News coverage on YouTube. And what happens? They actually have the person who's in charge of the vote tally in every constituency across the country comes out with all of the candidates and announces in front of everybody who won. And then they swear that the vote is correct to the best of their knowledge. Could you imagine? Could you imagine in the United States having two congressional candidates stand there and have somebody walk out and declare a winner on election night, not 4 months later or 4 weeks later? I guess it makes some of us happy when things turn out the way we want, but I don't know, I don't know that it makes me feel comfortable with our system that you still have state legislatures investigating outcomes. Get off my soapbox. I'm supposed to teach you. I'm teaching you not what I believe. I should teach you the facts. And so if you look at that, the exam questions, they're very factually based. Much of it's drawn from the book, from our slide presentations, the PowerPoint slides. So I wish you all well. If you have any questions or concerns going forward, feel free to contact me. And if you ever need anything, feel free to get in touch. Thank you.